Hello, ladies and gentlemen. As all of you are used to by now, I am a channel that covers Honkai and analyzes it. These videos come out as pretty critical in recent times, and some of it is outright trashing things that they do. I'm a person that doesn't like making videos that make me miserable, but venting does the exact opposite, and discussions of negative topics are necessary. When I do find something that I enjoy, like let's say something on Genshin, Wuwa, or ZZZ, even HSR, I'm so engrossed about it that I don't actually talk about the good stuff and instead use my time just playing and experiencing the good stuff. Because of that, I admit that I get motivated to make videos instead of actually playing the game when I see something bad rather than something good. It's become a habit at this point that when I feel good about something, I usually rather just experience it than talk about it on this channel. I know this is harmful for a supposedly unbiased channel since most of my content has now become negative. To kick this bad tendency of mine, because there are some positive things about HSR, maybe as a palate cleanser, I want to talk about the one thing that actually has gotten better in recent Star Rail patches, starting from around 2.6, and that is, please hit the drum roll, come on please, yes, enemy designs. Yes, really, this video was made after pollux, so don't think this is outdated. For this video, I'm going to be defining the design philosophies of endgame enemies in Honkai Star Rail and factors that make certain bosses feel fun to fight or feel really miserable to fight. First of all, let's start with the very early boss designs of Star Rail. Early bosses were obviously quite simple. A lot of it was surprisingly reliant on break meters to shine with both offensive and defensive mechanics. For example, the Ebonite Deer. Neutralizing the branches by breaking it with AoE attacks is basically the entire fight. Cocolia. She freezes you sometimes, and breaking Cocolia while she's charging prevents a very dangerous AoE attack. There were also bosses that had offensive mechanics that you needed to deal with. Kafka's crowd control needed cleanse on your healer, the Abundance Gorilla jumping on you needs to plan your SP usage, and Svarog wants you to time your ults to break his hand. Despite the variety of enemy mechanics, these enemies often don't feel good to fight nowadays. You can look at Blazes out of space in the current MOC as well as Kafka's dreadful returns. The problem with early Star Rail bosses was that the rewards simply didn't keep up. Ebonite Deer didn't reward you by doing its mechanic outside of the fact that you lived through it. Cocolia didn't reward you by doing its mechanic outside of the fact that you lived through it. Kafka didn't reward you by cleansing the CC outside of the fact that you aren't annoyed anymore. Generally, the bosses back then didn't reward you with offense, but purely with defensive rewards. This worked pretty well around that time since our sustains were limited and needed all the help they can get. But now that our sustains never have to fear dying even on auto, then it just doesn't feel good at all to fight a boss with its offensive mechanics as the centerpiece. Without these defensive rewards mattering, then what else is left of the boss that you have to fear? Svarog's return at the end of 2.7 was probably one of the worst displays of HP inflation in Star Rail. You couldn't make Svarog any more interesting to fight since the entire point is to break the hand to protect yourself. This is so incredibly easy nowadays and there's barely any punishment to it that it's not something you even think about when you enter the fight. So what does Svarog overcompensate with now that he's essentially been defanged and a non-threat? A huge HP spike. Whether you like it or not, Svarog can instantly put pressure with that alone. You no longer fear the hand grabbing you, you simply fear that you can't beat him in time. You can apply this to Kafka. There's plenty of ways that newer characters can counter Kafka's mechanic that you no longer fear Kafka like you used to, but unfortunately she now has 10 times more HP that you fear you can't even clear her in time. While most of these bosses in early HSR were like this, there were some bright spots. The Ice Grizzly lowering its own defense when consuming its minions, and Yanqing losing his own HP when you break the flying swords. These enemies not only had offensive mechanics you wanted to live through, but facing those mechanics head on actually gave you a reward for it, with Yanqing being the most impactful since it scales off his own HP. This makes them much more tolerable to fight if they ever return, but they aren't perfect by any means, since Yanqing would be laughably easy with the influx of a lot of implants. And the Grizzly's defense shred has a cap that we can reach pretty easily nowadays with Eidolons. But nevertheless, there's a pretty good reason why you never see these bosses again, and we get regulated to the HP sponge terrorists of Kafka and Svarog. Like I said before, these old bosses ran off the basis of offensive threats that got more and more counters to the point that it was no longer even a thought going into the fight. And so these bosses have a really good chance to be frustrating thick walls of HP to overcompensate. Not good at all. But to give StarRail credit from their past mistakes, they definitely steered the boss designs to a better direction. Let's talk about the designs after early 1.x, which is around 1.4 until 2.5. Bosses around this period have started to be a bit more interesting. The notable boss that released first was the Swarm, a boss that got completely out of control when it split itself enough and can get really itchy to survive through. Thankfully, once you do get rid of the pests, they leave behind this vulnerability debuff and also deal damage, making it easier and easier as the fight went on to kill the Swarm Mother. Argenti, the most notable boss, had a lot of rewards, shields, buffs, even damaging himself wasn't off the table. Like the Swarm, you get rewarded in pretty tangible ways for facing the mechanic than driving around it. Aventurine rewarded you with free ultimates, something Unto Death did too. The DOT Rex exploded itself to deal massive damage regardless of how strong your DOT is, just how many of it you had. Sam either burned itself or had their toughness locked, but also drained its own HP when it was aggressive. Past, present, future heavily damaged itself when you broke it, and staggering its breaks can give you more true damage. It simply wasn't defensive bonuses anymore. Bosses gave you something really useful to alleviate the stat check of enemy HP in addition to the previous benefits. This presents itself as a sort of a double-edged sword. These bosses don't need a lot of HP to be a threat as much as Varrock does, but they are much more specific and the bonuses are a huge stat loss. Past, present, future, if you are unable to break, feels completely impossible because you're missing an attack that cuts its HP to nearly half without breaking them. This can be a really bad thing, but thankfully they did it well enough with affordable options like Himiko to make it easier. There was also a problem with bosses like the Swarm and Argenti. Nowadays the threshold of damage for both bosses still isn't that bad, but at the end of the day these two are still stat checks. The quote-unquote mechanic that these two characters have can only be triggered by doing enough AoE damage. But if you can't do a lot of AoE damage, then how are you going to get those damage bonuses that are going to help you do AoE damage? You simply don't, I guess. If the bonus damage was attained without damage checks like breaking the enemy, it would feel much better. To cut back to reality, it's like a catch-22 of damage. The mechanics will help you do more damage, but you need damage to actually get more damage. It's way less egregious than Svarg at least, and it will take a while for them to be unmanageable in terms of HP, but at least we're getting somewhere. It's not perfect though. Aventurine didn't need you to do good numbers to fulfill Gamble, which is cool. Hule is relatively worse, and I'll explain why. Hule's main rewards are hitting you a lot and draining its own toughness. The problem is that Hule is so fast that his break state lasts for like a split second. And so if you play with its mechanic and see a tangible difference, you're either playing Fei Xiao, counter characters, or Bootil, which Hule actively doesn't play nice with at his core. He's just too fast. It would have made infinitely more sense if they drained HP instead of toughness when you clear off the stacks. Making Hule slower when he's broken would also help, but I digress. Not only did fulfilling mechanics have defensive purposes now, but also offensive purposes. Most of it though was attained through damage gates, and some weren't reliant on stats to trigger. Some rewards were good while others were pretty bad. These bosses are played pretty straight-laced though, but that's kinda what happens when you have Super Break take over everything, to be honest. There's been numerous reruns on MOCs with these enemies, and truthfully I don't really find them frustrating to play against because of these bonuses. It always feels like there's another way to optimize what to do during a specific moment of time a boss moves, and that's really good to make a boss engaging. Now we get onto the new bosses. For the meat and potatoes of this video, let's discuss the enemies starting from 2.6. I don't know what exactly happened, but these new boss designs shot up in quality across the board. Previously, I talked about how a lot of bonuses in bosses around Penacony were stat checks. There was an inherent level that you had to reach just so you can get a boost that widens the gap of power difference between you and another player despite having very close damage numerically. You either one-shot the Swarm, or you don't. That 1 digit of damage difference dictates whether you save 3 cycles or a fat 0. What changed on 2.5 is that there were more bosses that weren't necessarily stat checks and relied more on play, but academics cared about attack frequency and attack timing to give you a boss to your floor to work with. It also had a really high optimization ceiling, where some people can get enough turns to do a 0 cycle, but give the phone to another player and they may not be able to do it. After that was the implementation of War Armor, and specifically Nikador. I've grown to respect Nikador a lot as a boss. At the surface, it seems like just another stat check, but theoretically there's only 2 bosses in the game you are guaranteed to beat no matter how high their HP gets, and that's Sam due to combustion HP and Nikador. Because breaking War Armor drains so much of Nikador's own HP, on paper Nikador with enough follow-up attack characters has a set time limit before you are guaranteed to beat him with proper play despite any HP spikes he may get. This is how Fei Xiao is able to clear Nikador despite being considered an AoE check. The way you achieve this damage isn't locked to how much damage you do, but how fast you hit and when you do it, which is a really good way to scale later down the line. Unfortunately though, Amphorius can't all be winners. In 3.1 we got Flame Reaver, which is basically the Swarm but a lot more strict on a small AoE damage window, devolving a bit to the earlier category of just stat checks, but I guess we haven't seen those in a while. We also have these Pegasus and Griffin, which are complete garbage. Listen, bosses being stat checks only is bad, but those kinda have to exist, right, in a turn-based game. These 2 mobs not only are walls of HP, but are also really in love with just crowd controlling you. That isn't a problem either, by the way. The problem is that it's goddamn unblockable and you can do nothing to prevent it. It's gonna hit you if you aren't using effect res mitigation, which is rare by itself, and chances are your cleansers are gonna get CC'd too. Why, man? Why can't the marks just be cleansed? It's like fighting 2 Kafkas, no wonder why they put them with her. And lastly, the Netherwing, Castoris' sister. I actually quite like the Netherwing in the fact that it exists somehow in endgame. There's an aspect of it that I really like, but there are some things about this boss that gets rightfully criticized. Netherwing is at its core a healer check. You can use whatever character you want, but in a normal scenario this fight is not clearable without a healer slot in. Which is fine, because most free sustains are healers. This boss is very unique though, in the fact that its HP is so low to overcompensate for its stalling mechanic. In previous times, Svarog would get higher HP because he doesn't really shield anyone at his core because of the lack of his mechanics. Netherwing has lower HP because of how hard Netherwing shields 3 characters. This is by no stretch of the imagination the most shield a boss has ever done, and the criticism around it is rooted in one thing: clear mobility. One thing that Netherwing gets generally praised for, which I also praise it for, is how many characters can 5 cycle it. This is a boss that is an antithesis to what we've seen so far with the rise of HP inflation. Usually, due to HP inflation, a block is set on the recency of characters to where anyone before is a struggle and anyone above can do it. Those characters above the block have quite a lot of mobility to clear in lower cycles than 5. 0 cycling usually has around 6 or so characters that can do it. Netherwing is the direct opposite. The viability block is set so far behind for characters that can 5 cycle, but there's very little mobility to get to the extreme 0 to 2 cycles without a credit card. Because of how the stalling mechanic works, you can 0 cycle with Castoris quite easily, but every other meta character is hovering around 1 to 2 cycles despite not being that far behind in damage, and there is very little you can do about it. That is a pretty big flaw. Being able to 5 cycle with any character with a reasonable amount of effort is not a bad thing, but for anyone seeking to go beyond 5 cycling, Netherwing doesn't really have a lot of workaround to make your clear faster. A boss like Banacademics has a lot of clear time mobility depending on luck and how you play. In Netherwing's case, you don't have those choices because of the lack of interactivity. Netherwing is such a rigid boss. If you don't have 3 characters, you can't shorten its stall. If you can't heal, you don't clear. No matter what you do in the fight, Netherwing will just attack and do nothing else, effectively becoming a punching bag. This isn't what would be considered a fun boss. You play Netherwing the same way you play Svarog, except you're forced to play a healer and not forced to use a recent DPS. It's a very dull boss design from the jump, and not not allowing characters outside of 3 to interact with it makes you feel like your score is arbitrarily being pushed down if you're a regular low cycler, even though it's quite interesting that those that usually can't clear at all is getting pushed up to be able to 5 cycle. This causes a bunch of conflict of interests, let's say. The hardcore players do not like being arbitrarily pushed down by a roster check despite being easy. Netherwing doesn't allow a lot of gameplay expression, and hardcore players want bosses that they can express their low cycling skill with. But the others who main older characters love that they can clear in 5 cycles and want more bosses like Netherwing, rather than the other bosses where a block is set to where you can't clear with this character anymore. Both can be true at the same time. Netherwing's low HP is a good thing for everyone to 5 cycle, but there should be some interactivity with Netherwing to allow players to be able to sweat a little harder and even get to 0 cycling with tactical play. As it stands right now, it's so uninteractive that only 3 so far can 0 cycle without unnatural investment. It's not easy, but we should have the perfect balance to where most characters can clear, but people shouldn't be locked out of speedrunning without a small pool of characters. But academics is in the game after all. If you want me to redesign Netherwing, I would make healing count for the stall phase charging to have some form of interactivity outside 3 characters. Since Casterus has a million hits, maybe you should give a healing buff that scales off the amount of hits that you have to make sustainless possible. You can also make the boss drain HP to 1 on the phase shift and then doing an attack that can actually kill you. This would push people into needing to time their ults to heal, and if you're going too fast, then maybe that's a punishment. Either way, I think Netherwing has a good idea in terms of the HP that it has, but we're not quite there yet in terms of the interactivity. But anyway, aside from that little rant, ever since 2.6, the boss designs have been quite good in my opinion. Even a stat check like Flame Reaver was pretty merciful because of the turbulence allowing sustainless, which made it much less punishing than other bosses like Aventurine. I didn't even mention the Apocalyptic Shadow bosses that they threw out. Apocalyptic Shadow Hule is probably peak HSR fun design to me. It's not perfect, I wish they could tweak some things to make it the perfect fight. Blaze Nana, the Apocalyptic Shadow version of the Banacademics boss, is also really amazing. The Swarm Bug is soul crushing. Again, not saying every design in recent times is perfect, but the way boss designs in HSR are going, I actually really like, and I hope this video can show why that's the case and why I think objectively we're heading into a much better path. And I hope they are taking this more into that direction. But yeah, that's all for now. Please join my membership if you like, comment, subscribe, do the algorithm stuff. Thank you for Man42 for the highest membership tier. It's been a while since I made a long form video, right? So I hope this would satiate your hunger for a while. I will be making a Hyacin pre-release video, I guess, and yeah, I'll see you guys later. Bye bye.